Welcome to the Foundation Series, where we explore startup compensation with top minds in the industry. You'll hear from heads of people, from founders and VCs on how to drive results through startup compensation strategies and practices. Let's dive into today's episode. So, Paul, welcome. Great to have you here on the Foundation Series. I really appreciate your time joining me today to talk about pay transparency. How to introduce you? Octopus Deploy has been a company that has been renowned, certainly within Australia, I think, not just because you have a really novel name as a company, but also because you've been like a standout success within the technology space as well. But excited to speak to you today on the topic of pay transparency. I'm going to obviously get you to introduce yourself and Octopus and the things you've done in pay in a second, but I've always been really impressed with how forward-leaning I think you've been as a company in a lot of different aspects when it comes to your people practices, not just pay transparency. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the series today. So welcome, and I'd love to have you introduce yourself, share a bit about Octopus and about your role as a founder.
Oh, thank you. That's a very kind introduction too. So thank you, and thanks for having me. And hopefully this is useful for people who find it interesting. So look, I'm the founder and CEO of Octopus. I started it about 12 years ago as a sort of nights and weekends hobby project, and then eventually grew it into a business. And at the moment we've just crossed 300 employees. They're globally distributed around the world. Most of R&D is in Australia, New Zealand, and now Israel, and a little bit in Ukraine. And then we've got sales and marketing support geographically distributed everywhere. And we just crossed 100 million in revenue too, which was another pretty cool milestone.
Nice.
So, and look, we help companies with deployment automation, so all things CI/CD for your engineering teams out there.
And tell me, what's it been like being the founder of a company like this?
So Octopus started when I was 25, and I think I'm approaching 60 now. So,
In startup years.
Yeah, in startup years, exactly. It's different to what I expected. So I'm a software developer by background, right? That's how I got into this space and sort of fell in love with software creation. And so the thing I thought I would enjoy is, writing code and maybe building an engineering team. Actually, I think the thing I've enjoyed over the 12 years has been like there's always something that your organization can do just a bit better, right? Like we're really good at this, and this, but we're just not very good at this thing yet. But we're going to get really good at that thing soon. And so almost every year is a case of picking like what are the 2 or 3 things that we're not particularly good at that we need to get good at, and then focusing down on building that capability. And in that, I learn a lot about myself. I learn a lot about other people. And so that has made it a really enjoyable journey and has kept me engaged for many years now.
So I think Octopus first came onto my radar at a small developers conference here in Brisbane. I can't remember the name of it, but I remember seeing Mike, who heads up the engineering team there, who was talking about essentially like you had kind of open sourced your career framework. And I remember at the time being really impressed that A, you even had a career framework, but B, that you had kind of been so thoughtful about it and then taken the steps towards open sourcing that and making it available for anyone who comes across your website. That would have been 6 or 7 years ago. Fast forward now, and that same philosophy, I think, has spread to a lot of different parts of your business. Most kind of relevant to this conversation is pay transparency. Tell me a bit about the philosophy, about the sentiment that you have around pay as a founder and as part of your business.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess we started probably like every other company in the early days. We were hiring the first couple of employees, and they were both software engineers. And so we posted a job ad for software engineers. We put a salary number on it. We always felt it was really important that as the company, we're the ones naming the number and not asking people what they're currently on and things like that. So we hired the first couple of software engineers and we paid them the same because they joined at the same time to do roughly the same role. Then over time, as you do, you hire other people and they're doing slightly different roles. So you pay them slightly differently and you're thoughtful about it, but there's not a systematic approach to it sort of thing because it's only a few people. And then, of course, you end up hiring someone who's more experienced. And so you call them a senior software engineer. But now you have to sort of figure out what's the difference. I sort of know this person's going to bring more value, but what is the value that they're going to bring? And how do we sort of quantify that in a way that, feels fair? And so in the early days, I think we put a bunch of emphasis on having a defined career framework that people could really connect with. And this was definitely Mike's doing in the early days of growing our engineering org, because it was always the biggest organization at Octopus, where we wanted to have 5 different levels of what a software engineer is. So from junior, intermediate, senior, lead, principal, that sort of thing. And we wanted very clear criteria for all of those things. And so what we wanted to be able to do when we sit down with someone and say, look, we think you're ready to be promoted to a senior engineer, or we think you're not ready to be promoted to a senior engineer. Here's how we think about that. And if we share that in advance, then you can think about it too. And you can kind of make sure that you're working towards these things. And so it's a really constructive way to have conversations around performance with people. And then when we introduced that was also the time we started thinking, well, if we've got 2 people doing the same thing, we should be paying them broadly the same. So I think back then, going back 8 or 9 years, we probably had salary bands within those roles that were applicable. And I'd say that's probably where most companies are, and probably where they stop. As the company kind of evolved over time, we really leaned into having a very systematic approach to how we thought about compensation. And the way that I guess we always thought about it was, if we were to accidentally print all of the salaries that everybody was being paid and leave it on the printer, forget to collect it from the printer, someone was to pick that up and share it with the whole company, would we feel embarrassed? Would we feel ashamed? Like, would we feel like we're doing something wrong? Now that's different to, like, does everyone else agree? They might think it's really unfair. This person gets paid this and I get paid that. But it was very important to us that we felt like we could justify our decisions and we could stand behind them, right? And that's just part of being an ethical person. And so that was kind of always part of the system. And then over time, though, what we then introduced was a little bit more of a matrix model, where we said, okay, within those 5 bands, let's have different maturity ratings for those things. And we're going to have 3 maturity ratings. And so we introduced performing, exceeding, and maturing. Then if you imagine, the table now is 5 rows, and this is just for one career pathway for software engineer, right? So we've got junior through to principal. And then we've got 3 columns: maturing, performing, exceeding. If we were to say, this is what we expect of a senior software engineer, someone who's maturing is probably meeting like 70% of those dot points. Someone who's performing should be meeting like 90% of them. And someone who's exceeding is probably doing all of them, plus some of the things that would be expected from the next level up. So that's a way you kind of break down that matrix. And then what we said was, in every one of those cells in that matrix, there's not going to be a range. It is going to be a single number. And that's what we're going to pay for people in that role. And they're going to know where they are within that matrix. And again, this was probably 7 years or so ago we started to do that. And then, of course, we went and rationalized everybody, because over the years we hired a whole bunch of people for different rhymes and reasons. They had different salaries. And so we sort of normalized it into this thing. Over the years, things caught up. We got to a point where everybody was sort of fitting within that matrix. The thing that we did more recently, which I think touches on the transparency aspect you asked about, is we started sharing those tables internally. So within the company, you can go and look up for marketing, the marketing career pathway, what are the 5 levels, what's expected of them, what is the difference between maturing, performing, exceeding, and what are we paying people to do those roles? And so you can see yourself on that matrix, and you can look at your salary and you can say, I'm being paid the thing that the matrix says I'm supposed to be paid. And that goes a really long way, right? I think the thing people get wrong about compensation is it's not the dollar value. The dollar value actually, for most people, doesn't mean a whole lot. Like, it has an important meaning to their family and how they provide for them and so on. But by and large, people don't get emotional over that number, and it's not really very healthy to get emotional over that number. What they do get emotional about, and quite rightly so, is when it feels like it's not fair. When it feels like there is someone else doing the same thing as me, but being paid more, and less too, right? Most people don't really want to be the person who's being paid more to do the same role as everyone else either, right? Because they work in teams, and being a good teammate is important. So that was sort of our evolution over time.
Interesting story. I completely agree. I think so often it's less about the number and it's more about how it relates to peers or other roles outside the company that you could reasonably expect to be successful in, and am I being paid commensurate maybe with the market, things like that. So completely relate with that experience. You talked about the catalyst. I mean, I think that the question that a lot of people may want to ask is why. You've talked about the printer scenario. If someone were to walk past and pick up that piece of paper, I think that's a reason for having a solid foundation and logic behind your salaries. What was the main driver for then going, actually, let's just make them available. Let's just give them to people. And even if they walk past the printer, they've seen the numbers before.
Yeah. So I'd say part of it was just part of growing as a company. Like, as you add more people, things just become a little bit more complicated. And so as an example, when you have a system where people are just on different ranges, it becomes really hard even internally for people to justify, why is this person being paid $4,000 more than that person? We seem to do roughly the same role. We seem to have the same level of expectations from them. So I don't think ranges kind of ever make sense. And I think they're a pretty hard thing to defend from, like, is it keeping me up at night as a CEO? But then you have this systematic approach that we took, and that allows you as a management team, and it wasn't just a couple of us. As we grew, most of the sort of mid-level managers, for example, saw those spreadsheets. And if you were like an engineering director, you would see all of the engineers and you could see, yep, this is what they're being paid and this is where they fit within that matrix, and the spreadsheet says it should be this. So that's good, because then you've got a whole bunch of people who understand the philosophy and can explain it and defend it to people who haven't seen it. But it does, I guess, ask for a whole lot of trust from the average employee, let's say, who's sort of like, well, I've heard Octopus has this systematic approach to doing it. And if I'm being paid my salary and I know Octopus has a systematic approach to doing it, I suppose I'll just trust that the company is following that systematic approach. But there's no way to verify that, right? There's no way that they can check it. And actually, I think one of the catalysts was, over time, we would do our own little audits on it. And we would go and we would say, okay, for all the people that we've got, are they actually being paid according to what the system says they should be paid, for their level and band? And we screwed it up a couple of times. And the reason we screwed it up was someone got promoted, but at the time we had hiring freeze or something, and we were meant to pick it up 3 months later, or they're in probation because they'd only just joined, and so they missed out on one round of things. All kind of, I guess, understandable reasons, but not good reasons. And so as we would find those things, we'd go and fix it. But one of the things we realized is sharing the actual tables with people is super meaningful, because what it gave people was firstly a sense of confidence, like, okay, this is actually what the thing looks like. It's real and it's concrete. I can see myself on it and I can see if it's wrong, right? And so I can tell you if something's not wrong. And so that's good, right? It sort of puts power back in people's hands to be able to help us make sure the system is working as it's intended. And it also gives them a framework to think about the next few years, because they can look at that and can say, you know what, realistically, if I'm a senior engineer and I want to become a principal engineer because that's the number I want to get paid, can I meet that criteria in the next couple of years? Can I grow with the company? Or do I need to look at changing career pathways or go somewhere else? And so that was a really powerful thing as well. But the other thing we were quite transparent about is, here's the benchmarks we're using to come up with these numbers, and here's how we come up with them. And so people can go and check the benchmark data themselves and sort of feel like, yep.
Oh, okay. Wow.
We have a philosophy. So the way we think about it is, if you imagine those 3 columns, maturing, performing, exceeding, maturing should be like the 50th percentile of the benchmarks we can find for that particular role. Performing should be like the 75th to 80th, and exceeding should be in the 90th percentile. Now, that's hard to do because in reality, when you pull these benchmarks, they're kind of all over the place, right? There's some juniors at the 90th percentile who get paid more than seniors at the 50th percentile. And you need to create a table that's only going upwards, right, as people progress through their careers. So you have to normalize and flatten things, and there's a lot of art that goes into it. But people being able to go and see those benchmarks themselves and kind of say, right, Octopus says we pay the 75th percentile, and yep, oh, that works. I can see it, and that's what I'm getting paid.
Yeah,
I feel a lot of confidence in the system. Yeah.
So I guess you're kind of letting people check your homework in a way. Like it's a sense of, here's the set of numbers that we will share with you as part of our pay transparency, but here's the actual numbers that underlie those figures and what how we've kind of handled them to land where we've landed.
Yeah, and like, for some reason, companies are like really defensive about this. But if you imagine, like, what is the point? Like, what is the company trying to optimize for here? What we're trying to optimize for is, we want to hire the maximum number of really smart, talented people, that we can afford to do the work that we need to do. And we want to retain those people. And so we have to pay them competitively, or we won't be able to hire them. And we have to do that consistently, or, we can't just hire the new people at a higher rate, because then the old people, we will know they can earn more elsewhere. And so leave, right? So that's a silly idea. So you have to pay them all the same for the same work. And you want to pay them competitive enough that they're not really thinking too much about salary, right? And we sort of aim for, like, again, that 25th, 85th percentile. Yes, you could possibly get paid $3,000, $5,000 more if you go to another company somewhere else. Chances are you probably actually get paid less. That's what we're aiming for. Those jobs are out there though, but that's not the only reason we want you to be here. Yeah, but we want you to be compensated well enough you're not thinking. And it's important, right? Because then that also allows us to then maximize how many people we have, which also takes pressure off people, right? I'm not the only support rep answering tickets in this time zone because Octopus can afford 2 people, because we're not paying the 100th percentile, we're paying the 75th percentile. And so that's the sort of thing the company is optimizing for. If our benchmarks are wrong, we want to know, right? Like, I mean, it's ridiculous that if we have a software engineer who's been here for 4 years, they've built some amazing stuff, and they're leaving because they can make $10,000 more elsewhere. We should have known that. We should have had our pulse on the market. We're active. We're hiring in the market. We should have a sense of what's going on with that market. And we should be making sure our pay is, competitive to that. And when it's not, we're not just upping it for new people we're hiring, we're going back and we're fixing it for everybody else that's here as well. So they feel confident that the system's working. And so if people find better benchmarks, we encourage them, like, share it with us. If you get an offer from someone else, share it with us, because that's what we're optimizing for. We're not emotional about how much a software engineer costs, right? That's what the market says it costs. So we're just trying to keep as many of them as we can.
Yeah, so why hide it? It's really insightful. You touched on two things earlier that I'm keen to dive into. One of them is around what it's meant for people in terms of their own career mobility. So being able to identify a path that they may want to pursue and factoring in the salary as part of that decision. Maybe they do want to buy a house. Maybe they want to start a family, whatever that might be. The other is the trust side and the fact that you're going, hey, here's what we pay. We do pay consistently. And I want to touch on pay points versus pay bands in a second as well. But what's it done from a trust perspective? And I think, those dialing in here are probably going to be very interested from an engagement perspective and what it means for that environment. I think we're in an interesting space as an industry where I would say, and certainly a lot of research shows that trust is diminishing between employees and employers at the moment. How have you seen this counter that trend?
Yeah, I think sometimes, like, the worst place to be as an employer is, like, actually be doing everything right, but for people to have the perception that you're not, right? For people to have the perception, because then it's sort of like, at least if you're doing everything wrong, you'd be getting away with it, right? Like, at least there'd be some upside to it. But if you're actually, in fact, kind of doing everything as well as you possibly can, and people don't know about it, like, that's kind of a worse outcome in some ways.
Yeah, you're not cashing in on the trust credits, are you?
Right, exactly. And so trust is, like, hugely important, right? Like, I mean, the employer-employee relationship, obviously, like, we hold the power to some degree there, right? So we have to kind of be very responsible with that. And so by sharing those tables, it does give people a very high level of trust because they can see where they're at. They also know that, their peers are going to be there. Now, like, I think when people think about pay transparency, what they think, we're going to create a spreadsheet and we're going to put everybody's actual salary into that spreadsheet. So exactly what, Sarah's getting paid. But in practice, you don't have to do that. That's not required. If the goal is for people to feel like you have a fair and just systematic approach to compensation that's market competitive, you don't actually need to go that far. But what you can say is, here's the system. You can go and check your salary on it. And we're doing our own internal audits, but everyone else can call it out, if we've made a mistake here or there. And that can give people a whole lot of confidence in it. Now, it's not always perfect. And I would say, like, even within Octopus today, we probably have a handful of cases of people who aren't being paid according to what's in that matrix. They're not being paid less than the thing they should be getting paid, but sometimes they're getting paid a bit more. And the reasons for those are purely historic, right? Like, every case is a bit different, but they're self-correcting. And so I think that's, like, the ideal spot to go, I guess, as far as transparency goes. And I think internally, actually, we share with people, they know which of the rows, as far as, like, they know they're a senior software engineer, right? They know they're a level 3, and they know their peers are as well. They know for themselves whether they're maturing, performing, exceeding. They don't know if their peers are maturing, performing, exceeding. And part of that is really awkward, right? Fred's maturing, what does that mean? So the person knows and the managers know, but it's not broadly known outside of the organization. And so you don't actually know what Sarah or Fred are getting paid because it is going to be somewhere in those 3 numbers within that row. And that does give people some privacy, I guess, as far as what their income is.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? That's a relatively personal thing in the sense of you're on a personal performance trajectory. It makes sense that that's something that's kept between the leader and the individual. What's it done for those conversations though? Like, as a manager, I'm imagining that has just made these conversations infinitely easier. If you think about, and you've worked in other companies before where you maybe haven't had the level of pay transparency or even the level of definition around pay practices or pay philosophy. What's it done for you if you contrast the experience here with the experience there in terms of those conversations and the ease with which your managers and people are having them?
Yeah, I mean, there are some downsides. We can talk about, I guess, some of the challenges that do come with it, but it is very much mostly upsides, I would say. If I go back to before Octopus, I worked for a consulting company for a while, and within that company, I don't think they really had that systematic of an approach to compensation. And generally, and you find this in every role, there are people who feel confident asking for a higher salary every year, every 6 months, and there are people who don't. There are people who just sort of silently get on with the work and sort of assume that they'll be rewarded over time. And that was me, and that strategy worked well for me over time, but it doesn't work for everybody. And certainly it's easy to create systems where people are overlooked. And then even when it does, when you say, hey, I think I should be getting paid more for this role. I've matured a lot in the last few years. They kind of just throw a number at you and like, is that enough to kind of get you to go away? And actually, that doesn't really satisfy me. You can actually give me a lower number if you help me understand how you got to it and it feels fair. Like that's, and if I contrast that to like, I think the manager experience at Octopus, right? So someone comes and says, hey, manager, I've been here for a couple of years now. I think I should be getting paid more. Well, you can deconstruct that question. You can say, why do you think that? Do you think because the market for your role has changed in the wider market? Are you seeing job offers? Are you seeing friends doing the same role who are being paid more? Because that's data that our people team would really like to know because they can factor it in when they do their benchmarking rounds next time, right?
Yeah.
So that's half of the reasons why you might think you deserve a pay rise, just because the market is booming for your role. And the other half is because, like, no, I'm doing different things, right? I was doing this and now I'm doing that. And so I'm a senior and I should be paid more. Well, we've got fairly well-written criteria for what's involved in those things. Let's go through them together. And you know what? Actually, I agree. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have said yes on this dot point, but now you can. So yep, let's go and make that case. And we do performance review cycles every 6 months to pick up, those kind of things, because it's really important that people aren't languishing for too long. So that's a really powerful thing for managers. It puts the benchmarking problem to the people team because they can spend the time doing that. And for a manager, generally my focus is on the people I've got and the expectations they have and the career pathways they want, and are they meeting it? And it's those two things combined that's producing the number they're getting paid.
It's one less thing to worry about, right? So often managers are left scratching their heads around pay decisions and having to try to justify them to their people. This takes a lot of that out of it because they've got the context behind what a pay point constitutes because the language is there, but then also it's just a point and it's not a band. And so now suddenly it's very linear in that sense.
Yep. And it also gives everyone a sense that it's happening fairly as well, which I think is actually the most important thing in this whole space. Now, the managers do have to be prepared for other questions, though. So, for example, because we share the salary tables for all of the roles within Octopus, right? And so you can go and see what does the job band for IT look like? What does the job band for marketing look like? They're all different numbers. And we can kind of maybe talk philosophically about, why that should be the case or why it is the case, whether it should be or not. But they're different. And so the manager actually has to be prepared to explain that. Do we pay designers differently to engineers? Do we pay product managers differently to engineers? Why do we do that? But they can also lean on the people team who can provide some of that explanation.
So before we had this conversation, you shared with me the compensation philosophy, which I think was 70 pages of a slide deck. But again, it went into such nuanced and intricate detail. Have you found that being able to go to that length has made those conversations easy because they can speak to the nuance there in the background?
Definitely, because everyone in your organization has joined with different context, right? They're all different people. They all went to different schools. They all have different politics. They all have different lived experiences. They've worked at different companies. And so what you have is this melting pot of people with different experiences. And most, I guess, the way a lot of people and HR practices work, there's sort of like default way that a lot of companies do kind of stuff. And so people assume that's how it must work here as well. And this is an area that people do care a lot about, particularly they care about the fairness, I would say, of it a lot. We've always operated under this philosophy of we're hiring really smart, talented people. And so you're hiring these smart people, you need to trust them. And not because they earn the trust, you should sort of default to offering a really high level of trust as they join and leaning in on that. And so part of trusting people is trusting that they are worthy of being given an explanation of why something is the way it is. Like, I don't know if you have kids or not, but like the argument of like, because I said so, it doesn't work on toddlers, right? It doesn't work on adults, certainly, and not in a workplace. So for us as a company, in every decision we've made, every controversial decision, and even a lot of the basic decisions, we assume our people are worthy of us taking the time to explain to them. And it may not be the explanation they want to hear. It may be different. They may think we should do something different, but we assume that they're worthy of hearing that, and we lean in on that, and we over-explain, here's why for the people that care about it. And then what's powerful about that is if there is something we could be doing better, we get to have a conversation around that's really well informed. The most frustrating thing is when you've got this gap between what the company thinks it should be doing and what the employees think it should be doing, and employees are angry at the company because the company should be doing something different, but it's without context. They don't really understand the nuance of it, and that's because you haven't explained it to them and you haven't assumed they can understand the explanation. So we really lean in on explain everything, and then if we're doing something wrong, let's have really constructive conversations around the reality of the thing we're doing, not the sort of thing that you perceive that we're doing. So that's where the transparency matters a lot too.
So defaulting to trust, I really liked, and actually reading through the Kant philosophy, what I loved about it is that throughout key sections, you actually just ask the question, does this make sense? Do you align with it? Do you have any questions? And I think something that I often see in conversations around compensation is that a lot of companies and people within them presumably are trying to be all things to all people. And as a company, you need to pick who it is that you want to employ and bring along on your journey and tailor and cater as much to that population. But sometimes it's going to be to the exclusion of others. And presumably you've had people who have gone, actually, I don't agree with how you try and pay people here. And so maybe they will opt out. And that's okay sometimes. Have you found that as part of the journey, or maybe just an alignment?
So I think there's parts of that deck that are possibly a bit controversial that, talk to. And I thought we'd have some people who would, so I guess I kind of operate under this idea that I don't owe you the explanation you want. I owe you the explanation that I think is accurate and correct. And then you can feel about it how you want to feel about it. And if your decision is then the company's not right for you, that's okay. You've done great things. You'll go on to do great things elsewhere. We'll go on to be a successful company. It's totally fine, right? If we have different points of view. What I'm not going to do is assume that that you won't understand. If I was to really take the time to explain a point of view to you, I'm not going to assume that you would be disingenuous enough not to try to listen. Right? I'm going to assume that you will try to listen and see it from my side, and I will do the same in return. And I'll assume that you're smart enough to understand where my argument is coming from. And likewise, I'd hope you do the same. So that's a really important ground, I guess, for the company to agree on. And so, like, for example, in the deck, we talk about this question of, okay, why do different roles get paid different amounts? Why do software engineers get paid more than marketers, right? Because, we're not hiding that. It's a clear thing within the tables as you'll go and look at them. And so, where does that come from? And we lay out the sense that our job is to hire as many people as we can. In order to do that, we need to make job offers that they will accept. And so it has to clear a market price. And the market price for all roles is different. And we actually don't want to overpay people for a role, right? If the software engineers are paid more than the marketers and we go and pay the marketers what we pay the software engineers, what it means is we just can't afford as many marketers as we could otherwise have. And the marketers we do have are the most overpaid marketers. And so they're never going to leave, even if they totally hate the company. So there's all kinds of bad things to avoid in that. As a company, we actually don't care what we pay the marketers or the software engineers. It's just there's a market price that we're trying to clear. It's just the reality that we're in, and it's the reality you're in. Now, you as a company, you could sort of say, what, we are going to pay the software engineers the same as the marketers. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to do that, but you could certainly decide to do that. And your employees may say, that is the just and right thing to do. But I guess my view of it is, no, that's how the economy works. That's how the market works. Our job is to build amazing products for our company. We need the most smart and talented people as we can. And so we're just totally upfront with that. Like, hey, that's how we think about it. And if that's a problem, there are other companies to work for. That's okay, right? But at least we've been honest with you, which a lot of companies aren't. Like, we've been totally honest of where it comes from. And it doesn't come from the cabal of CEOs that get together every 6 months and decide how much do we pay people or something, right? It doesn't work that way.
You're not supposed to talk about that, Paul.
No, I said the quiet part out loud.
The first rule of the cabal.
I mean, that would never work, right? Because the first person to just be like, oh, cool, I'll just pay everyone more than what the cabal agreed would get all the good people. So it doesn't, it's a market. It's a market like anything else. And the other part, I suppose, is you have upfront conversations around, like, how does gender kind of play into that, right? And so in the philosophy of the systematic approach that we have, it doesn't matter what your gender is, you're still going to fall within some part of that matrix. So you're going to be paid exactly the same as your peers, no matter what their gender is. That's really important. There's other questions around gender you can look at too. You can look at performance review time. Who gets the promotions? Who gets put into maturing? Do people linger in maturing longer? If we look at the sort of outcomes of performance reviews from a low result to a high result, where do they tend to fall as far as gender goes? And if all of those things are looking really well, then you've got a system that is fair and is doing the right thing. But then there's a reality of, like, we hire software engineers. The broader talent pool for software engineering isn't 50-50 male-female, right? Like it just isn't. It's a very long way from that. And so what's our obligation in that world? Is it to get to 50-50 engineers, that are male or female? No, that doesn't make sense, right? But at the same time, if the broader talent pool is like 20%, then if we're 5%, we must be doing something wrong as well.
Yeah, there's a problem there.
So as a company, we just lay out, this is the philosophy, this is how we think about it. If you think it's wrong, then tell us, but we get to have a constructive conversation and learn something from each other around how it can be improved. Because there's definitely parts of it we're thinking of tweaking and improving on, but they get to be concrete things about the real thing you're doing, not what people think you might be doing based on what their old company did.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I'm keen to wrap that up as well into the topic of pay points versus pay bands, because I think, certainly again, my experience, the people that are prepared to negotiate, and it's just an inherent part of our society, in a lot of different places, is that when they get to the stage of offer, a lot of people feel prepared, and like negotiation is just a step in the road. You've got pay points, which presumably eliminates that entirely. How have you found that approach? Because another thing that I get from a lot of, whether it's founders or heads of people, is that they want flexibility in their pay structures. Now, you already aim to pay generously. So presumably when you're speaking to a lot of candidates, they're probably not seeing the same maybe caliber of offers in the market. But how have you navigated the elimination of negotiation, if you have?
So again, there's a way you deconstruct that, right? So you say, like, through the interview process, we've assessed that we think you're a senior software engineer. We don't think you're a lead. We think you're a senior. Within that, we think you're performing. Like, we're pretty confident if you join within the first 6 months as you learn stuff, you'll be performing. We don't think you'll be meeting what we expect of exceeding. So this is where we've placed you, and this is the number, right? By the way, like, the number, we do vary it by country that you're in, so it's not quite like one number. If you're in the United States, you get paid differently, but this is the number, and that's the number we give when we offer. Now, let's say that number is 125,000 or something, and they say, look, I want to negotiate that up. I think it should be 130. I think 140. It's like, where is that coming from? Is it coming from actually you think you could be a lead? Is it coming from you agree with us that you're kind of more within this senior? This is the set of dot points, and this is where you fit. But you're just seeing offers out there that are better. We want to know about that, right? And in fact, there was a few years ago, where engineering salaries were just ratcheting up like crazy. And so our people team at the time were making offer after offer. Usually, we're making offers, and probably out of every 5 offers we make, 4 of them get accepted. And then suddenly we have 6 months where we're making 6 offers and 1 of them is getting accepted, and the rest are all saying it's too low, it's 10 grand off, it's 20 grand off, other offers that I'm getting. You just sort of say, what are you doing, guys? We've got benchmarking data. Benchmarking data is helpful. That helps us get to a number, but we are in the market. We're hiring for these roles, and the market is telling you something. The market is telling you that the price of this role has gone up. Up it, up the offers we're making to people, right? That's where the flexibility comes from. But be prepared. You can't just hire someone doing the same role and pay them more. You have to go and do it to everybody else.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the knock-on effects.
If you were to say, we can only offer this extra salary to this person because we're hiring them, but we can't afford to do it for everybody else. If you can't afford to pay them what the market says they're worth, you can't afford to replace them, right? It's going to take way longer to replace them. Actually, in every role we have, engineering, sales, like, there's such a long ramp time for people just getting productive within our company that it's a completely crazy way to think.
Difference over and over and over before they've even become effective in their roles, right?
Yeah. And so even from a budgeting point of view, you might have a finance team that's like, but the knock-on effect of meeting these higher than expected salaries is going to be this. Well, tough. That's what the market's selling. And in fact, if you have a compensation philosophy like we do, which is we are trying to pay at a certain percentile of the market, and the market is changing, it's not a philosophy if you only stick to it when it suits you and you abandon it when it doesn't, right? That's just wrong. So you have to say...
And it's damaging to trust, right? Like, we talk about how much something like this can build trust, this can totally undermine it.
It totally undermines it. And so, whereas actually then when you go and do it and you say, like, hey, Fred, guess what? You just got a pay rise because we've been hiring software engineers lately and they all seem to be getting paid more. Like, how does Fred feel about the company? Like, this is incredible. You've just probably retained Fred for a really long time, right? Because not because of the money, but because the trust. And now he knows, that you're looking after them.
Yeah. And so how often do people have to advocate for themselves to do that? And whether they feel prepared to or not, or confident to or not, is a whole other thing. So the fact that you've completely taken it off the table for them and just come to them and said, hey, here's what we're paying others that are doing a commensurate level role. Congrats, here's an increase to reflect your value to the company. It's a huge boon to those people.
There's also, like, psychologically, I guess, when people are negotiating salaries, partly it's because, like, they have a low level of trust in companies. They think companies are just trying to pay them as little as they can get away with. And so they feel like they have to advocate for themselves.
It seems zero-sum, right?
Yeah, exactly. So why not? If you're not going to advocate for yourself, who's going to? That's a very valid, line of thought. The other part is, like, sometimes people, you can tell, like, they actually don't want to negotiate, but their partner or somebody is, like, pushing them to do it. And so there's like they have to be seen to be negotiating for themselves. That can sometimes be like a bit of a role. But again, like, showing them, like, hey, we are paying you this. This is the benchmark data that we've got that goes into it. It's a very, very fair offer. it's what we pay all the other people doing the same role. That can make you feel very comfortable doing the thing. It can convince your partner who has a stake in this. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. There's other people out there, so unless you're hearing it over and over again, and then in which case your benchmark is wrong. Yeah.
Which is a key point, right? Is that, benchmark data only gets you so far, and then it is a lagging indicator. It's something that was what people were paying whenever they conducted the survey. So the fact is that those who are in the market and accepting offers now may be on a very different salary. And so I think it just talks to that partnership that, if you're ahead of people, it's about making sure that if you do have someone who is focused on salaries and developing them based on surveys, that they are also speaking to the talent acquisition team and understanding whether or not those offers are being effective. Because if you're not, then you're just not going to have the talent.
And to the managers within those roles too, right? Like if you're an engineering manager at Octopus, you should kind of have your ears to the ground as far as what's going on in the talent market. That's really important. Now you will get like the anecdotal stuff you'll hear is like people will always tell you, like, oh, I got a mate who's being paid more for this thing, but they don't tell you about the other 5 mates they've got that are being paid less for it, right? So you have to be thoughtful. And really the test is pick the number that you're offering to people. If they're accepting it, you're probably fine. You're probably clearing market, And the same actually when you get a benchmark, if the benchmark says the role for this is this, and it's massively different, you've just hired 3 people to do that thing, and you had no trouble, none of them complained about salary, then you're probably doing fairly right,
Yeah. No, that's really cool. What are some of the tips that you would share with founders, or some of the incentive behind doing something like this? Why should others think about following in these sorts of footsteps, or what would you say to them to convince them?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of those laws, they definitely come from a good place, and they probably do work to the degree that, like, if you, and we've done this, you post a job ad for a range that's higher than what you're currently paying people are going to see that, and you're kind of silly to think they're not going to see it, and so you better be prepared to answer why. That was before we had a system like this. But I people game them, right? So you'll see a job ad and it's like, oh, the range for this is anywhere from 80,000 to 250,000. Well, that's ridiculous. So that doesn't do anything. No, I think actually, if anything, the internal transparency is way more important than what the transparency that you're showing on the job ad. But it does kind of matter. Let's say, as a founder, you started a company because there was a problem in the world that you wanted to solve, or you wanted to paint, your creative abilities in a way that people could experience and admire. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons you started a company. Chances are HR policies probably wasn't one of them, right? It's like, of all the things you have to deal with as a CEO, it's probably not the thing that gets you out of bed, particularly because it's a touchy subject, it's an emotional subject, all of these kind of things. And so as a result, I think what most founders do is sort of try and make it someone else's problem, or they just kind of wing it and they don't put any sort of systematic thought into it. Or they don't really want the conflict that sometimes comes with being transparent. They overthink. Like when we share the benchmarks internally, some of these benchmarks are really wide ranging, right? Like I said, junior engineers where the percentiles kind of beat senior engineers, just because that's how the data collection happened and the sample size is small. And so you share something like that internally, of course you got to be prepared for someone to ask the question like, well, the thing says this, why are we only paying this? And you got to be prepared to answer that, and people don't want that conflict sometimes, I suppose. But I can tell you, being systematic, being thoughtful about this stuff and getting it out there, it actually, the amount of time that we now spend worrying about stuff, it's not like Brett asked for a pay rise and I don't know if I should give it to him. What's Jody going to think about that? It's just, there's a system and you just follow the system. And if you're getting enough feedback, there's something not right with the system, you fix the system. It's actually super powerful. And again, people care about the fairness more than anything. So if you lean in on being more transparent than you're comfortable with, assume that everyone on your team is smart enough to understand your explanations of stuff. And if they haven't understood it, you probably haven't explained it very well, and just keep trying. Accept that you're probably not going to make everybody happy, but you owe them an explanation. Understand that it's the fairness part that probably matters more. They would be the tips.
Yeah, I think you touch on a critical point, which is that by not having a system, as a founder, this is a topic that is definitely on people's minds all the time. And by not having a basis or a grounding in which your people can speak about it or understand how it's done, it's occupying time that could be spent focused on the job and delivering outcomes towards your mission. But it's also taking up time of your managers. It's taking up times of your head of people. It may even be taking up your time because there's no basis for which these decisions are being made. And so, it just makes all of that a lot harder.
And that's the tip of the iceberg that you're seeing, because the bottom part of the iceberg is like the gossiping that's happening around things, the sort of assumptions people are making, like, there's all this sort of like untapped productivity that comes from people wasting time feeling like they're being treated unfairly when maybe they're not. Like we said, that's kind of the worst outcome, right? Because if you're treating everyone unfairly, at least you kind of get to pocket the difference, but you don't you don't even get that. So one thing I'm really proud of within Octopus, so like I said, with 300 people, we've been going for like 12 years. We've never had an employment tribunal issue. We've never had to involve lawyers in any kind of employment thing. It's super squeaky clean. And the thing I would attribute that to is we just treat people well. We treat them like humans, right? We don't give them reasons to be upset about things that we do because we try and conduct ourselves well, you know. So.
That's a great point. It's a solid risk mitigation for those sorts of compliance issues.
Yeah, like HR. This is my biggest bugbear, I suppose, with traditional HR, particularly leaders, is this feeling the company gets that the people team, the rebranded HR team, let's say, is here to protect the company or is here to kind of toe the line on company policies. It just doesn't work anymore. Like, it probably never really worked, and it definitely doesn't work now. What the people team is here to do is make sure that we are living up to all of the things that we've said we would, right? Like if this is the philosophy, this is the compensation, this is how we think people should be treated, the people team's job is to help ensure we are living up to that. And often that is actually siding with the people rather than siding with management, because management's got thick skin, we can take it, but people need help. So that's what the people team has to focus on. If you do that, you don't have problems, you don't have disputes.
Yeah, I agree completely with that sentiment. And actually, it's a nice segue to sort of the last part of this this interview that I'm keen to hone into, which is this is an audience of heads of people or chief people officers. When you're a founder, you're heavily involved clearly from the philosophical aspects of how this sort of stuff is developed. But in terms of what your expectations are, head of founder, when it comes to compensation as a commercial skill set, what do you think are some of the key traits or attributes you look for there as the leader of the company?
Yeah, so I think one of the things you really are looking for is you want someone who has this, like, they agree with that philosophy that you have, right? So in my case, the compensation philosophy that we have, I need a head of people who actually believes in that and wants to make it even better than what it is, right? It can't be someone who doesn't understand where that's coming from. I think like any executive, if you have a people team leader, they're probably reporting to the CEO, right? And that's a very dangerous thing to be doing because the CEO is a unique management role in the company that actually has no clue how to manage you. So if you're the head of people and you hire a talent acquisition leader, you can manage them because you probably did the job once upon a time. But the CEO, by definition, probably hasn't run all 12 functions of the company to a great degree. And so they can't really coach you on this, but they will have, and hopefully should have, a very strong sense of how they want the people to be treated and what the lived experience of, like in our case, what the lived experience of Octonauts should be like at the company and what's good enough and what's not good enough. What are we not going to stand for? So you have to listen to that and make sure you're supporting in that, but they're not going to be able to give you much career advice or coaching. You have the standard kind of executive challenge of you've got to spend as much time building relationships with the CEO, but also with all of the other people in the management team, right? The way we think about it is like the management team is a team that runs the company on behalf of the CEO. And secondarily, they all happen to have different functions reporting to them, but it's a team first and foremost. And so you can't just pipe up when there's a HR question, right? You should be just as involved in how well our marketing strategy is working or the design of our R&D organization. Like, all of those things are important, but obviously be respectful in those things. And then your team as well, right? That's the one thing that CEOs don't see, right? We see you as a manager and as an executive, and we see your interactions with your peers in the executive team. But unless we happen to be doing a lot of skip levels and spending a lot of time understanding all the people that are reporting to you, it's actually really hard to get a sense of what the lived experience of those people is like working for you. And so you're very much entrusted to be treating those people well and empowering them to be successful. And so obviously taking great care in that as well is really important.
Yeah, amazing. I love that answer. That's really insightful. I don't have anything else to add to it. Trying to think of something witty, but no. This has been amazing. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to delve into it, not only the philosophy itself, but the impacts that it's had across the business. You're the founder of a successful SaaS company. Any key or lasting pieces of advice for a head of people that's wanting to join or be part of a company like yours?
I think like all these things, it always just comes back to the basics, right? So if you're the people team leader, your job is help the company make the most of the talent in all of the people that we have. Help us to recruit them, help us to keep them, help us to motivate them. And so like getting too focused on processes and systems and all of those things help, but it kind of has to come from a point of what is the lived experience of the people who are working in the company on a daily basis, particularly the people sort of at the bottom, let's say, of the organization, like really being their advocates, listening to them, helping ensure that's how we get the most out of the people capital that we have, I suppose. That's the main thing, right? That's the thing that will, if you can kind of keep that at the core of every single thing that you're doing every single day, that will go a really long way. And yeah, I lean in on transparency too. And I don't think it comes, actually, like HR is probably one of the roles that struggles with transparency the most, because like by definition, if, Fred has made an accusation about Bob, that's not going on the public intranet, right? Like that's a HR case, so we're going to deal with it in a particular way. And in like pretty much every document HR creates is a private document. And so like they default to a really low level of transparency, almost that's how they're trained, but actually like transparency matters a lot.
Yeah, as a profession, I think it's been born out of confidentiality being a cornerstone of what they've done. And so I think that's transition. Personally, that's part of the reason why I think a lot of companies have been slow to adopt pay transparency practices, even though you look at the legislation that's coming in, you look at early career people. I mean, it's not a taboo topic for them. They will tell you their salary gladly. They'll speak about it openly. But I think, again, because we're a function that is emerging from that kind of back office, confidential policies, that sort of approach, personally, that's why I think we've seen a slothful adoption.
You're totally right. Like that's the reality. And it's a good thing. Like you should assume that people are talking about this stuff, even if you put in their employment contract that they're not supposed to talk about salaries or something. I mean, that's just asking them to talk about it even more, right? But assume that they are, like really assume they are. How do you make those conversations really positive then? Like this is the way to do it. Be open and transparent so that if people are talking about salaries, it's coming from gosh, aren't we lucky to work for a company that, treats us like humans worthy of respect and does the right thing by us. Like make that an asset, the fact that they're talking about it, not a sort of liability that you're trying to hush.
Yeah 100% agree. Amazing. Before I do wrap up, are there any other aspects of this that you want to dive into?
We were in the news a little while ago for like gender pay gap stuff. It was like a giant hornet's nest that I went and hit.
Yeah.
So like, and I'm actually like happy to talk about it.
So let me start by saying, so within Australia, so for those who aren't familiar, we have the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and they just this year have released the gender pay gap. So the unadjusted gender pay gap for companies in Australia with more than 100 employees. And so I'd love to understand your experience through that process. Talk to me a bit about what you think that number represents and how that could be helpful and maybe less helpful for companies in terms of how they position it as part of their DEI strategies.
Yeah, I think it's a very well-intentioned thing, but it has come with some challenges. And so, and they're going to be different, right? Like, so when I say that, you might sort of jump to a particular conclusion about where I'm coming from in that, but I'll try to sort of explain my thoughts. So the way it works is we're taking all the male salaries, we're taking all the female salaries, we're averaging them up, and then we're looking at the difference between those two things. Mm-hmm. That's how it's calculated. And it's Australia only. So we report it in Australia for our Australian employees. But if I was to take my executive team, for example, the 3 women on my executive team, they're all based in the United States. So they don't count towards the numbers that we report to Wikia. And that kind of ratchets down the organization, right? Where it just geographically, we just happen to have people in different countries and the balances are different. And that doesn't seem like something the company should be optimizing for, right? Like we want a diverse team. It doesn't have to be diverse in a particular country because our teams work geographically anyway. So we want to hire the most talented people, that we can find regardless of which country they're in. And so it has that problematic aspect for it. And the way someone explained this to me is like one of the challenges with this is like women for a long time have been in roles that have been underpaid, like historically underpaid. And there's a very deep sense of unfairness towards that, as there very well should be. Particularly, there's many women will point to experiences they've had working in companies with people doing the same role but being paid more for it, right? Like that's a visceral experience a lot of women have had, and so it's a very emotionally charged topic, and not for for good reason. But the problem is then it's being rolled up into a statistic, and the statistic is then kind of being used to paint companies or their practices in a particular way. And that is important from a society point of view because it helps to drive a really important society conversation, which is, there are career pathways that are predominantly chosen by women and career pathways that are predominantly chosen by men, and they tend to be paid differently, right? And is that fair? That's a very good question for like Australian society to be asking and answering and having a debate about. But then you get down into an individual company, you say like, okay, within Octopus, like I said, we've got marketers and we've got software engineers and we pay them differently because that's the market that we're hiring into. It's the reality of the market that we're hiring into. And it's driven by a few things. It's driven by a software engineer can write some code and I can sell it to one customer, or I can sell it to 1,000 customers. It has a huge scalability aspect, of that. It's a hard role to hire for. There's just not as many graduates as the industry needs. It's a bit easier to find people within marketing. But the gender differences going to those two roles are quite different, right? Marketing's like 50-50, male, female. Software engineering's, like best numbers maybe like 20%, and then it drops to as you get further into career pathways. So at more junior levels, it might be higher, but as you get later into career, and because we work remotely, we tend to hire more on the senior end. It's harder to find people. And so then you have this challenge of like when you average those two things up, what you find is like if I go and look at my software engineers, male and female, they get paid the same. If I look at my marketers, male and female, they get paid the same. But when I add my company together, I don't have many marketers. I have a lot of software engineers. The software engineers tend to be men. The average skews, and so I get a negative number, on that. And then we try and unpack it, and we say like, oh, what does this negative number mean? Like, what does it tell us? So if you were to say like, okay, you've got this pay gap, where is it coming from? There's a whole bunch of really valid questions you'd ask. You'd ask questions like, well, for people doing the same job, are they being paid the same? Well, firstly, like, that's not just like a Wijia thing. Like that's been the law for like 20, 30 years, right? Like you should be doing that because it's like morally right and it's reprehensible not to. But of course, people get around it because they have like salary ranges and they sort of, this person's doing a slightly different role. But like, I think you've got to be much less granular than that actually to feel like you're doing it fairly. So, so there's like that question. Then there's the questions around like how they get promoted. There's a question of how they're treated in performance reviews and those kind of things. Now, and I think that's the helpful thing, right? You can come up with like 10 questions within your company that speak to the lived experience of women versus men working within your company, as far as, do they get the same opportunities? Do they get the same promotion rates? All of those things. And if the answer to all those things is like yes and generally pretty good or a bit of room to improvement, let's do some stuff next year to make this particular thing better. But you still get to a point where you have like a large gender pay gap that's just mostly driven by one role tends to be overwhelmingly male compared to other roles. I don't see that as a number that's particularly helpful for me. You try and think like, how do I correct that, right? So what I could do is I could hire more female software engineers at the junior level, because that will help get more people in, and I could do some stuff to maybe get more women to choose software engineering as a career. And there's probably a debate about like how much should we be doing that or not. But like even if we do that, that actually makes the gap worse, because then we've got like still overwhelmingly male senior engineers and junior female engineers, and they're being paid less, and so the gap actually like widens, right? And even if you think like, okay, well in 5 years though, they'll all become senior and it will even out. Like it doesn't unless it's 50-50, right? And so then the only way to do it is to hire 50-50 at the junior level, but the graduation rates aren't 50-50. And so the only way to do that is to be really biased in your hiring process. And that's wrong, right? I don't think you should be able to, you should do that. Bias in either direction is wrong. And so actually like then you can start to do stuff like actually, what the trick is, you hire just male junior engineers because that will skew the male salary down. But you don't want to be doing that. Like that's horrible too. So the challenge for companies though is because this is such a charged topic, what it does internally, like within any company, you've got a group of people who care very rightly, very passionately about this, and they want to see the company living up to its potential and its obligations in this space, right? And so I would say, like, when you think about the systematic approach that we take to this, when I think about, like a lot of the stuff that the lived experience that women have probably had working at other companies, like it doesn't exist at Octopus because of how, we're set up and things are structured. Ideally what you'd have then is like those people who care a lot about this topic would really understand what you're doing, would feel really proud of the good stuff that you're doing, and would be telling you for the areas you can improve on, right? And advocating for those specific areas where like, hey, we're doing really good at, these 9 things, but this 10th thing, like that's a room to improve. That's where you'd have people engaged. The challenge though is when you get a number like the Wijia report that gives you a big negative number and you get a bunch of press and stuff around it, like we had for a little while, is like internally those advocates, they feel a real cognitive dissonance because like, well, I think the company does everything right, but like everyone's bashing it. So, maybe we must be
Yeah.
doing something bad. And they actually just disengage, is what we found through that process. So those people who sort of cared about this topic the most actually became like the least vocal, because they were struggling, I think, with that cognitive dissonance. And, they care about the people who outside the company who are not informed about what we're doing, being quite vocal about that. And the people inside sort of didn't want to, be caught in the middle, right? Let's say. And so, and I think that was actually like a bit of a setback, like in terms of people who care about this topic, actually being able to really engage and constructively help the company, get better, as we always have room to improve. So that was a bit of a long answer.
It's no, but it's really great to hear, from the inside how companies face that challenge. And I'm hearing, A is the fact that it is this kind of signposted number that does get put out there, which does affect your employer brand. I think you'd be crazy not to think about how it impacts people that are considering working for your company. But I'm hearing that it's impacting the advocacy that your people in the company have as well, and maybe quietening them down. So interesting to hear from the perspective of, okay, well, yes, it does only take into account the Australian population. And so for global companies, that can be quite a challenge. And then it's, the question around, well, what can you do to change that on a societal level? And what are the things or the compromises or maybe biases that you have to implement or things you have to do to be able to achieve that kind of golden ratio that people are looking for? I think there's a whole conversation here. It's such a deep and topical area, because you can go into things like, well, how do you look at internal mobility into some of those areas? There's people where you might say, well, would you be an advocate for raising the average salary for those female dominated professions? There's a whole range of ways in which, on a purely number basis, you can look at adjusting it. But I think regardless, it's really fascinating to hear what that journey and experience has been for your company.
Yeah, and we definitely took it like really seriously, right? Like as even before they were publishing the numbers, like we would look at it and we would ask these questions though internally around, like, okay, what does this mean? What is this telling us? Because we've set up a system that should be really fair, that shouldn't have these kind of issues. So what can we learn from this? And I think where we got a bit disillusioned, I suppose, was sort of like chasing answers to the question. So you come up with all these hypotheses, right? And they all start from a fairly dark, negative place about bad things the company must be doing. And as you sort of disprove each of them, though, it's kind of really hard to shake, like, oh, but -17, -12, whatever the number is a thing. Yeah, the geographical part is real, because you also have, like, in our case, most of the people we have within Australia are in R&D. Right, so it's like really engineering centric, whereas like my marketing team is only like a third of it is in Australia, the rest is in the US and the UK, because that's where the customers are.
Yeah.
So like it skews even further, like in those respects. So I think if I was to advocate for like one thing from WGEA or from folks who care about that conversational movement, would be actually, I think, getting some agreement on like the so what, right? So if you say like, okay, here's what the number is, so what? What's the hypotheses behind it? What are the 10 questions you could ask that would help you understand, is this just a result of how the statistics are gathered and how the career pathway gender choices shake up, or is it because of practices the company can be improving on? Because WGEA do ask about a handful of practices you have as a company, but like I don't think they actually do ask about, of the last performance cycles, who tended to get the high scores, who tended to get, like, there's actually a lot of really good questions you can ask in that. And I think if companies
that help
were
look beneath
sharing
the
that
surface
stuff
a little bit.
Yeah, and like if the answer to all those 10 questions is like the company's doing really good, then you sort of don't need the negative score, and you don't need the sort of frustration that gets channeled, like the valid frustration people feel in this space that's being channeled. Because like there's definitely companies with really good scores who right? Like you're in the industry, like these companies have horrible practices, and there's companies with good practices that get bad scores, and like it's a very imperfect bludgeon, I guess, to be hitting companies with, and it's losing allies, I think, is the concern, right? Like people who care about this space are sort of getting a bit disenfranchised from it as a result.
This has been really insightful. I very much appreciate the conversation. I love talking about this stuff. So, Paul, thank you so much for joining me on this. I'm sure there's a future edition. There's about 3 or 4 other topics I feel like we could tackle on this. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in to the Foundation series. Stay ahead in startup compensation by subscribing and joining our community of startup leaders. Until next time, I'm Matt from Foundation.